On December 5, 1975, the weather in eastern Pennsylvania was bitterly cold, and a cold wind blew through the quiet neighborhoods of Lancaster County. It was an ordinary day, but no one expected a crime to tear the quiet atmosphere apart, haunting the community for nearly half a century. Around 8 p.m., Celeste, a middle-aged woman, and her husband had just left a basketball game at the local school when they stopped by the apartment of her niece, Lindy Sue Beckler, for a quick visit. Celeste had intended to stop for just a few minutes to see if Lindy, whom she loved like a daughter, was okay. But from the moment she got out of the car, something was wrong. The door to the apartment was wide open. There was no music, no soft lighting. A floor lamp had been knocked over. Furniture was scattered. Celeste's intuition told her that something very bad had happened. She walked in. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was labored. And then she saw a sight that froze her heart. Lindy lay motionless in the middle of the living room. A dagger was stuck straight into her neck. The floor was covered in blood, long streaks that seemed to drag and smear. The blood was not just a life lost, it was a silent scream from a girl who had not yet grown up. Celeste screamed, ran outside, bumped into her husband, and screamed in panic, "Call the police! Call now!" Red and blue headlights quickly flashed outside the small street. But by the time the police arrived, all hope of saving Lindy's life had disappeared. A 19-year-old girl, married just over a year, living a peaceful life in a peaceful residential area, murdered in her own home. No warning. No one heard the screams. No signs of forced entry. No one saw anything unusual. As the crime scene was reconstructed, the investigators, who had seen dozens of murders, stepped back, gasping for breath. One said later, "I've seen atrocities. But this was something else. It wasn't just murder. It was torture." The knife in her neck was only one of two. Lindy had been stabbed 19 times, with 2 knives, one of which the killer had brought with him. Blood was everywhere. And when they examined the body, they discovered something even more horrifying. The body had been violated after death. The killer wasn't just a killer, he was a demon hiding beneath human skin, and the most haunting thing, it all happened right where Lindy thought she was safest. The small apartment she and her husband had called home. Where she had hung her first Christmas wreath, set the table for the new year, that place, now the scene of horror. And nearly 48 years later, the question still hangs in the air. Before Lindy Sue Beckler became a name on the murder investigation files, she was a little girl with soft brown hair, kind eyes, and a smile that made others want to smile. Born on January 31, 1956 in Lancaster County, Lindy grew up in a broken family. Her parents divorced early. Her mother raised and protected her every step of the way. Her father remarried, lived in the suburbs, and had another son, a half-brother that Lindy affectionately called Little Brother. Despite the complicated circumstances, Lindy never let the hurt erode her heart. On the contrary, she loved everyone with all she had. Since childhood, Lindy was very active, curious, and adventurous. She was a member of the Girl Scouts, loved climbing, rowing, and was not afraid to try out any club she liked. But when she came home, she was the little girl who loved to lean her head on her mother's lap, watch TV, and laugh heartily, a soul that was both independent and soft. In her 20s, Lindy started working, first as a secretary, then finding a job she loved more, making flowers. She worked at a small flower shop in town, where she was not only an employee but also a part of the family. She helped to renovate the shop before it opened, cleaning the windows, rearranging the pots, as if she were helping to create a new home. Lindy loved to make Christmas wreaths, and was very proud of the first one she made herself, a small piece for a bigger future she had yet to reach. Shortly before the murder, Lindy had married Philip Beckler, a handsome, quiet art student who had fallen in love with her at first sight. They met by chance when Lindy was visiting her sister, and Philip lived nearby. Their love was simple, unpretentious, but so genuine that Philip's grandfather, the officiator, once said, "We were born to be together." After their wedding in October 1974, they moved into a small, pretty apartment. Philip went to school during the day and worked at a car rental company in the evenings. Lindy worked at a flower shop, coming home a few hours earlier than her husband every day. The evenings waiting for each other to come home, the simple meals, the plans to move to a bigger apartment next year, that was the scene of a happy life that was just beginning. Friends said Lindy was a little shy, but cute. She smiled a lot, liked to tease others with witty sayings. Although she was quiet, she always left a deep impression on those who came into contact with her. No one had ever heard of her having enemies, but, beneath that gentleness, Lindy had a silent fear that no one could explain. Since moving into her new apartment, she often told her husband and friends that she felt like someone was watching her through the sliding glass door at the back of the house. Some nights, she turned on all the lights and locked the door when she was home alone. She said she was often startled by small sounds even though there was no one else outside. People thought she was overly sensitive. But later, when the truth was known, everyone shuddered. Could it be that Lindy had sensed someone was secretly watching her even though she didn't know her face? Lindy Sue Beckler was not just any victim. She was a symbol of a life in full bloom. A dutiful daughter, a gentle wife, a young girl living her own little dream. A dream was brutally taken away, and left America speechless for nearly half a century. Friday, December 5, 1975. The first chill of winter had settled over Lancaster County. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air carried the familiar scent of honeysuckle, the scent of the holiday season, of Christmas approaching. For Lindy Sue Beckler, it was just another day: go to work, stop by the bank, buy groceries, then go home to cook dinner. She had arrived at the flower shop early as usual that morning. Her co-workers remembered Lindy as cheerful. She talked about the Christmas present she had made for her husband, a clay paintbrush holder she had molded herself. She wondered how Philip would like it, giggling like a little girl. She also talked about her plans to move next month. The new apartment was larger, with room for Philip to use as a studio. They were planning to get a puppy. "I'm going to name her Holly," Lindy said, as if everything was already set in stone. Around 5 p.m., Lindy left the flower shop. She stopped by Philip's office. He had just been paid. She picked up the check, said goodbye to her husband, and went to the bank to cash it. Then she went to the local supermarket. The groceries, milk, vegetables, bread, were simple necessities. A normal dinner. A family Friday night. At about 5:45 p.m., Lindy arrived at her apartment complex. From the parking lot, she had to carry 4 bags of groceries into the house. Because of the volume, the police later determined that she had to make 2 trips, once to bring them in, then back for the rest. And in that brief moment, the killer struck. There was no sign of forced entry. No broken glass. No screams. No unusual sights from outside. When the police arrived later, Lindy's shopping was still on the dining table. Some of the items hadn't been put in the refrigerator. The kitchen light was still on. She had barely entered the house, before taking off her coat, before cooking, when she was attacked. The neighbors heard nothing. Lindy's apartment was on the ground floor, with a back entrance leading to a dark, sparsely used courtyard. The only thing they remembered was a dark-colored car parked there, its headlights on, but no one could make out the license plate, and even the car disappeared within minutes. No one saw the killer's face. No one thought it would be the last time they saw Lindy alive. At around 8 p.m., Lindy's Aunt Celeste stopped by. She had intended to say hello. But what she saw was an open door, a broken light, and a room that was anything but ordinary, then a scream. Then blood. Then the irrevocable truth. The police later confirmed it. Lindy had been stabbed a total of 19 times, with 2 knives, one of which had been taken from her own kitchen. The killer left a knife in her neck, but wrapped the handle in a kitchen towel, obliterating fingerprints. A large male shoe print was found near the dining table. And on her pants, traces of another barbaric act, mutilation of a corpse. Just hours before, she had been smiling brightly about the first Christmas wreath she had made. Hours later, she lay motionless in a pool of her own blood, too late to save her. Little did Lindy know that her killer had probably been watching her for days. Knew her routine. Knew when Philip would leave for work. Knew when she would come home alone, knew, and had chosen that day. Lancaster County Police had seen their fair share of crimes in their careers. But when they entered Lindy Sue Beckler's small apartment on the night of December 5, 1975, they held their breath. No one, not even seasoned investigators, could forget the sight. Lindy's body lay in the middle of the living room. She was fully clothed. A kitchen knife was stuck in her neck, piercing her carotid artery. Blood spurted out, staining the ash-gray carpet, but that knife wasn't the only one. After an autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Lindy had been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives, one carried by the killer, and one taken from her own kitchen, 11 stab wounds to the chest and upper abdomen. 5 stab wounds to the back, indicating that she had fled and had been stabbed from behind. 3 stab wounds to the neck. The fatal stab wound had penetrated her carotid artery, causing acute blood loss. That wasn't the worst of it. Under the microscope and through histological examinations, forensics also discovered signs of postmortem abuse and extremely sick behavior, only seen in killers with advanced mental disorders. Not only killing, the killer also satisfied his sexual desires on the corpse. That was no longer a crime. That was an act of evil in human form. There were no signs of a break-in. No stolen belongings. Wallet, jewelry, wristwatch, all were intact. This made the police eliminate the possibility of robbery. And if it was just for sexual satisfaction, the killer wouldn't have needed 2 knives and 19 stabs, the investigator affirmed. He didn't kill Lindy for sex. He killed because he wanted to dominate. He wanted to torture. He wanted to turn a good girl into a sacrifice for the perverted desires deep in his mind. As the police looked more closely at the scene, they saw that the grocery bags were still on the table. Some of them were unopened. The milk cartons had not been put back in the refrigerator. She had just entered the house, meaning the attack had occurred almost immediately after Lindy opened the door. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, but there were scratches on her arms and hands, indicating that she had fought for her life. But all to no avail against a large, strong, and well-prepared attacker. On the floor, the police found large male shoe prints, size 10 or 11. No fingerprints. The knife had been covered with a kitchen towel, a sign of careful, calculated action. Finally, the forensic results found semen on the victim's pants, conclusive evidence of post-mortem assault. In 1975, DNA technology did not exist. The only thing they could determine was her blood type, but they needed a suspect to compare it to, and they had none. At that point, all the investigation was based on intuition and traditional screening. And so, a list of dozens of suspects began to form: husbands, friends, co-workers, men who had passed by the apartment building that day. All were questioned. All were wrong. The biggest question still hung in the air. No one had an answer, and before her family could bury her, the killer disappeared, leaving behind pain, fear, and decades of cold silence. In the early days after the murder, Lancaster County police focused all their resources on the shocking death of Lindy Sue Beckler. It wasn't just a horrific crime, it was a blow to the community's sense of security. A 19-year-old girl was murdered in her home, in a quiet residential area, and no one heard a sound. The police started with the closest person, Lindy's husband, Philip. They assumed that, as in many other cases, the killer was someone close to them. Even though Philip had an alibi, he was working at a car rental company at the time of the murder. The police were reluctant to rule him out as a suspect. He was questioned repeatedly and subjected to a polygraph test. He cooperated fully, but his eyes were blank, as if his soul had left his body. "I don't know anything. I just know she didn't deserve to die like that," Philip repeated. After weeks of investigation without any conflict, Philip was cleared of suspicion. But his life never returned to normal. He dropped out of school, he dropped out of painting, he dropped out of himself. A young man newly married, now wandering aimlessly, living like a ghost. The next suspect was Lindy's boss at the flower shop. He was single, middle-aged, had commented on Lindy as very beautiful, and had even received a birthday muffin from her the day before she was murdered. Those seemingly innocuous details became the reason he was summoned. The police searched his home, ordered him to take a polygraph test, all of which came back negative. Over the course of several months, the police interviewed more than 300 people, sifting through every little clue, from former classmates, neighbors, co-workers, even people who had passed by the apartment building that day. But no one had any concrete evidence. No one remembered seeing anything unusual. The killer seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving the scene cold and unsolved. Then came the anonymous letter. A year after the murder, the police received a confession letter, written in 2 different handwritings. The author identified himself as the killer, confessed to killing Lindy, and begged for forgiveness, asking for a blessing from the priest. The chilling letter spoke of not being able to control himself, and that he would have killed again if he hadn't been caught. The letter caused a stir. But after investigating, the police discovered the author had used a real name, Janice, an innocent woman living in the area. She was shocked to learn that someone had used her name to create a sick joke. The letter was later deemed a fraud, full of malice. Time passed. Investigators retired. The case file was transferred to the archives. Lindy's family visited her grave each year in tears and in silence. They didn't give up, but they lost faith. At one point, the police suspected Lindy was a victim of the Zodiac Killer, a notorious serial killer in California in the 1960s. At another, they thought she was being stalked by someone in the neighborhood, or was being targeted by an opportunistic criminal. They brought in fortune tellers and psychics. They checked every person with a criminal record in the area, every person who had bought a knife in town. They tracked down every car parked near the apartment that day. All led to dead ends. In 2006, nearly 3 decades after the murder, Lindy Sue Beckler's case was transferred to the Pennsylvania Cold Case Unit. With new hope, DNA technology had advanced enough to uncover the past. But then a heartbreaking truth was revealed. DNA samples from the crime scene had been badly damaged due to improper storage. There were very few traces left, not enough to track down by traditional methods. It was as if fate was trying to keep the killer's identity a secret. In 2019, Philip, Lindy's ex-husband, heard about another local case, also solved after 27 years thanks to genealogy forensics technology. He called the police. And for the first time in 44 years, a real light appeared. It was no longer intuition. No longer a polygraph. It was science, and the drop of DNA was waiting to speak. In 2019, nearly 44 years after Lindy Sue Beckler was murdered, a new light was cast on the dusty file. It was Lindy's ex-husband, Philip Beckler, who had been a suspect, who had lost everything, and who had never let go of his wife's memory. He heard about the case of Christy Merrick, a young woman murdered in Lancaster in 1992. That case had also been deadlocked, until a drop of semen that had been preserved for 27 years was analyzed using genealogy forensics techniques, tracing DNA back to the family line, thereby identifying the killer. He contacted the police, and the cold case unit agreed to try one last time, sending the only remaining DNA, a semen sample found on the victim's pants, to a lab. The sample was passed on to C.C. Moore, one of the top genealogists in the United States. From the unknown genome, she began to build a DNA family tree, starting with the faintest genetic connections, like piecing together a picture from a scrap of paper. The results stunned everyone. The DNA traced back to a small town in southern Italy. After analyzing thousands of family trees, C.C. eliminated thousands of individuals, and narrowed the suspect down to just one name, David Sinopoli. The Lancaster County police were stunned. The name had never appeared in the records. No one had ever suspected David. No one had ever questioned him. But when they checked the old records, they discovered a chilling detail. In 1975, David Sinopoli lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy Sue, just a few apartments apart. In the same hallway. In the same elevator. They were neighbors. David was about 23 years old at the time. No one remembered him clearly. No one remembered him ever speaking to Lindy. But no one needed to remember, DNA did. The police planned to secretly follow him. In 2022, David was 68 years old, living just a few miles from the old crime scene, with a wife, children, grandchildren, a quiet, harmless old man. But they knew, behind that face was 47 years of silence as a killer. On February 11, 2022, at Philadelphia International Airport, investigators waited. David was with his wife, drinking coffee at the waiting counter. When he put the cup in the trash, an FBI agent immediately seized it. That paper coffee cup was the most valuable evidence of nearly half a century. The DNA test results from the cup's mouth matched the semen sample on Lindy's pants in 1975. There was no doubt. An additional drop of dried blood left on the victim's sock, thought to be Lindy's, also matched David Sinopoli's DNA. He may have injured himself in the act. The DNA fragment that was thought to be dead now becomes a scream to denounce the perpetrator. Early in the morning of July 17, 2022, nearly 47 years after the crime, the police knocked on David's door. He did not resist. He did not ask why. He did not beg, and he did not confess. When he was put in the car, the neighbors around were still surprised. David? Him? Impossible. He was so gentle, grew tomatoes every summer. Greeted everyone, But the truth does not need anyone to believe. Because it has been proven by DNA itself, David Sinopoli, who lived more than half of his life as a model husband, father, and grandfather, was the one who stabbed a 19-year-old girl to death, raped her body, and then silently continued living as if nothing had happened. David Sinopoli, 68 years old, silver hair, medium build, expressionless face, walked into the courtroom in an orange prison uniform. On the surface, he looked like a gentle old man living out his final years with his children and grandchildren. But everyone in the room knew this was no ordinary man, but the ghost of a crime nearly 50 years old. Lancaster County Court announced David Sinopoli was charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault after the victim was dead, and trespassing. During the initial hearings, he remained silent, refused to plead guilty, refused to speak to the media, and even avoided eye contact with Beckler's family. The defense attorney asked to suppress evidence from the coffee cup on the grounds of invasion of privacy. But the judge denied it, because collecting from a public item is perfectly legal under federal law. Prosecutors laid out the full picture of the crime. Lindy Sue had just returned from work and was carrying groceries into the kitchen. David, the neighbor who had been watching her closely, had been lurking, waiting for her to be alone before breaking in. He attacked her from behind, stabbing her repeatedly with 2 knives, then raped her after she was dead. He then wiped away all traces, took one of the knives, and left the scene as if nothing had happened. During the trial, an investigator said, he lived like a normal citizen. He got married, had children, had grandchildren. But in reality, he carried the body of a young girl with him for nearly 50 years. Every meal, every Christmas, every day, he lived with his own crime. Lindy's family, now only distant relatives, sat silently in the courtroom. Her parents were dead. Her husband, Philip, sent a letter to the court, not appearing. In it, he wrote, "I'm not here to hear him apologize. I just want the last thing Lindy deserves, justice." And then, surprisingly, on October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli changed his plea. In front of the judge, he pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, desecration of a corpse, and trespassing, as part of a plea deal with the prosecutor. No defense, no explanation, no apology. The courtroom was silent. The judge simply nodded, then announced, David Sinopoli, with a sentence of 25 to 50 years in prison. Because of your age, this is effectively a life sentence. You will never see the light of freedom again. The man who had been a silent neighbor, who had lived 47 years as if he had never committed a crime, now died in prison, with the indelible title of murderer and necrophiliac. He did not speak, no diary entries, no private confessions, no reasons. Only the police theory that David had obsessed over Lindy, stalked her, fantasized about possessing her, and one day, could no longer contain his sick desire. Lindy did not know him. Maybe she had never said hello. Maybe she had only walked across the hall where he lived, and that was enough for him to choose her as his victim. The Lindy Sue Beckler case is more than a brutal crime, more than a lingering pain that has lasted nearly half a century. It is also a legacy of the power of memory and science, of the perseverance of those who refuse to accept that it is too late for justice. When David Sinopoli was sentenced in 2023, there was no applause in the courtroom. There was only silence, a deep, final goodbye to the 19-year-old girl. Lindy's relatives, childhood friends, former neighbors, even her co-workers from that flower shop, now in their 60s, all felt the same thing. It was never too late for justice. We can't bring Lindy back, said the lead detective. But at least we can tell her, we haven't forgotten. The story of Lindy Sue Beckler has become textbook material in forensic and investigative academies across the country. It's included in cold case seminars, a prime example of how a drop of DNA, if preserved properly, can become the most powerful witness. Victim advocacy groups have cited the case as evidence of the importance of preserving evidence properly and the need to invest in genetic genealogy. A new wave of forensic science is being driven, not by technology, but by a humane desire to make sure no one is forgotten. There is one silent witness of all, though, and that is Philip Beckler, the young husband. He has never remarried. He has avoided the media. He has made no public statements. But those who know him say that every December 5th, he sends flowers to the cemetery where Lindy is buried. No name. Just a small card, "I'm still here. You're not gone." When asked what keeps him going after nearly 50 years, Philip simply says, "Because she couldn't get justice for herself. So I had to do it for her." In the darkness that has lasted for nearly half a century, where the crime was buried, a smoldering fire still burns. It is not the light of the police, nor the light of the courtroom. It is the silent light of memory, something that will never truly go out if anyone remembers, if anyone believes. The story of Lindy Sue Beckler is not just a murder solved after 47 years. It is a mirror for the question, how do we treat the dead, especially those who have died unjustly? There are places where people let memories fade. There are legal systems that close cases because they think time has eroded justice. But Lindy's case proves that time does not erase crime. It only makes justice more difficult, never impossible. From the dogged efforts of an ex-husband who was wrongly accused and lost everything to the new police officers who never met the victim, to the scientists who patiently pieced together the faintest fragments of DNA. None of them worked for a conviction. They worked for a belief: no one is too small to be protected. No one is too late to be heard. In an age when the victim's name is often lost to the fame of the perpetrator, Lindy Sue Beckler is remembered not for the way she died, but for the way an entire community refused to let go until her death had an answer. She is not forgotten. She is not just the victim of 1975, she is Lindy, the girl who loved to make Christmas wreaths, the young wife just starting out, the girl who laughed and sometimes feared the darkness through the glass, and from that darkness, light is finally coming. Slowly, but surely. The Lindy Sue Beckler case is a testament to the simplest thing the world needs to remember: every human being deserves love and justice, both in life and in death. No one can bring Lindy back. But by speaking her name, through her stories, her lessons, and her commitment that this will never happen again, we do the closest thing we can to a resurrection. We keep her memory alive, and in every unsolved case around the world, hope remains, because there was once a Lindy Sue Beckler. And there were people who refused to give up.